up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Game Dev Unchained, the #1 game development podcast about game development and the lifestyle thereof. I am your host, Brandon Bam, and with me, a special guest, Ben James. How you doing,
Brandon.
Ben?
Hey, good. Cheers for having me.
All right. So this is the part of the podcast where I actually let our guests, which is yourself, to introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers out there about who you are, where you've been, where you at, where you heading. Just a little intro.
Yeah, thanks. I'm here calling in from Vienna, where our company is headquartered. We started building 3D generative AI technology about 3 years ago with funding from the European Union. And I personally am trained as an architect. So I come from a background that's really at the intersection of design and technology, and somehow ended up in game development, building virtual worlds for everyone from some large AAA game developers to small and medium indie-sized guys.
Awesome. Funny enough, I think you're like my third architect that I met in the game industry that somehow ended up in our industry. But it's a welcoming thing because you guys add so much to it. So let's go ahead and talk about AI in general, right? Your company Atlas, like what is Atlas's role in AI? Just kind of kick it off.
Yeah. So what Atlas does is Atlas looks at collections of images. Stereotypically, this might be concept art from a particular game developer, and tries to distill what are the underlying patterns, relationships, anything that it really can out of those reference images to create generators that then create 3D models and texture those models in alignment with the style of those reference images. So I think in a large way, what we try to do is offer an alternative to either manual modeling or more commonly procedural workflows that's a bit more creative. I think that is a little bit where we started. Our journey was we looked at the way that large open world games are created a couple of years ago, and we saw that procedural tools, which are very impressive, are used, but felt that in many ways procedural tools aren't that creative. Basically, on a more technical level, the solution space is no. In order to have a really cool Gothic generator, you really need to write all of those conditional statements or looping algorithms. So you need to think in advance of all the different iterations and combinations of form and texture that can create really nice Gothic pieces. But AI is a little bit different. Gen AI in particular is a little bit different because the algorithms are goal-oriented. So you basically say, well, this is the style that I want to embody with these concept images. And this is the constraints that I want. I want to generate a whole city, for example. And then the algorithms are evolving in order to generate that. And that basically means that your solution space is near infinite. So you can do many more creative things. And it becomes a little bit more just how creative the individual, the artist, or the game dev wants to be when they're creating their worlds.
So we're definitely at a crossroads in terms of transitioning part for the industry as a whole. AI, I think, is a lot more welcome than most people would like to admit. It is like a time saver. It does have a lot of it's an essential tool that's going to be a part of game development going forward, like it or not, right? But obviously, there are concerns with the ethical things around it about, with artists kind of concerned about their own job safety and all this stuff. So around these conversations, your personal opinion, your company stance, just what can you say to these artists that are just worried about what I feel is going to happen, right? Or is happening?
It makes sense, right? I mean, also the industry as a whole, regardless from AI, is in a really tough position at the moment. I think our stance has always been that AI should be something that augments the intuition of an artist. So I think I take an example from architecture. For example, when computer-aided design came to architecture, everybody said, well, all this means is you're going to be able to draw floor plans faster because you'll be able to use the computer to do that. They didn't imagine that there would be new formal languages that arise for buildings, for example. Or a different example would be, one of the ones that I like is that the first television broadcasts were broadcasts of people reading the radio program, just because they didn't know where this technology could go. And I think in many ways that's a little bit where we're at with AI. So there's a lot of fear, and it will be disruptive. I think there's no way around that. But the way that I think about AI is it puts more emphasis on the artist's creativity. It puts more emphasis on things like narrative or intellectual property or game design, holistic game design mechanics there, because fundamentally what it does is it lowers the barrier to entry for a lot of other people to come in and also generate really interesting, at least with our tech, really interesting virtual worlds, environments, and assets. But at the end of the day, you're not going to click, in my opinion, you're not going to click one button and the job will be done. It's more about how do you work with the tech in a meaningful way. So in our case, what are the reference images you might give it? What are the sort of iterations you might make with the AI in order to improve the generated results? And then ultimately, how do you take that data that the AI has created, ideally in a structured and proper way, that you can go and make it your own with those little one-off adjustments that no AI is ever going to be so detailed and granular to build out. So I think it's tough because it is going to be disruptive, and I can imagine that a lot of people are skeptical of it. But at the same time, I think the artists who start to embrace it as a tool to maybe not necessarily even just be faster, but be more creative because they used AI in the process, I think those will be artists who end up thriving and creating the next generation of really exciting games.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely I feel underrepresentation of the amount of artists or developers that are using AI in their workflow. I think there is definitely a vocal minority that are really speaking in the defense of the fear and the job loss and stuff like that. But when you're in the Mid Journey Discord channel and you see these people just like endlessly prompting, I was like, come on, like everyone's in here obviously using these tools to enhance their development, right? And I often kind of relate it to there's a lot of especially in games, right? I feel like games are always iterating on tools and technology because development is so demanding, right? In terms of quality and speed, right? Those are the two
Yep.
things that we're always kind of hitting our head against for milestone and shipping dates. And disruptive technology like mocap for animators, for photogrammetry for environment artists, character, actor
Yep.
scanning for character art. These are always, I think, in this small way, have always been uh, questioned whether
Yep.
this will erase what essentially was someone's job to do that one thing. But only we've only seen like those team uh, growing larger
Yep.
because game developers tend to put more instead of like working with less.
And I think from my perspective, I've seen two sides of this. So we've done postmortem with projects where we've been able to quantify that the technology we've built does lead to efficiency gains. So that there we can we've done projects where we were able to generate a city of 20,000 unique buildings in the
Yeah,
time that a team was able to create 100 of them. But when you look at that, I think when we talk to game developers, they see that in two very different lights. So if you speak to a really large publisher, for example, they're usually looking at team sizes that have maxed out. Basically, they can't, even if they onboard more members into their team, they can't even manage them effectively because there's so many hundreds of people in that.
right.
But what I like is when we speak to maybe a small or medium-sized game developer, they look at that and think, okay, well, I can create. I've had this idea for a huge open world game that I've never been able to build because it's too expensive, it's too time consuming. But if I use the technology, now all of a sudden I can make that world come to fruition, or I can make a world that involves something like user generated content, for example, because now I'm able to have the technical structures in place to do that. And I think that's really cool. If the technology is enabling something new or enabling a game developer to build something they've always had in their mind, then to your point, all of a sudden the teams are growing anyway, because you really want to make that huge open world game, and just being able to create all of the assets and environments is only part of that. Now you need more people to help build out all the rest of it and the narrative around it.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting time, and I think people are more and more getting more receptive about it. I think the tides are changing in terms of like the company support. You know, we seen like a couple of years ago, or maybe last year, Blizzard was probably the first major player that was like, "Hey, we're gonna use AI training
Yeah.
f- on our own content. You know,
Yeah.
our own concept. We're not scraping the internet. We're using our own to kind of train our model, which is legally the most ethical way of doing it.
Perfectly.
Ha-
Yeah.
yeah, but still, there was still backlash about that. I was like, what are you talking about now? It's like at this point, and I guess yes, the fear among s- things being done a certain way is changing. It's legitimately there. Um, but like talking to artists, and you're interfacing with a lot of companies, introducing your product. I'm I wonder what is truly your gauge and reception, and in terms of like these different developers that you're talking to, like what is it on the ground floor you're seeing versus kind of like what's the headlines right now against AI?
I think, the people that we talk to probably are a bit more receptive to AI than the maybe the general class. But the other thing I would say is that in our technology, AI does a lot of the stuff that I don't think any artist is super excited about. So,
Yep.
uh, adding UV mappings to geometry, uh, the AI can handle that as part of its generative process. So I think in many ways, oftentimes actually the artists tend to be the champions for us within an organization, because what we're doing is giving them a tool that allows them to focus on the creative aspects of design without a lot of the banal, boring, mundane work that goes along with that. And so, actually, in our experience, the artists are usually pretty supportive of us, and actually, so usually is the kind of the C-suite level. Where we find a little bit of a sticky point is that in between, that kind of middle management layer that just wants everything to stay exactly the same. And I think that's in part because change for them is very disruptive. They've built out a pipeline in a particular way, and they have a rule that fits that very well. And so, our pitch always there is, of course, we build tech that plugs into Unity, plugs into Unreal, plugs into Houdini, plugs into Blender. That we want this to be also for the artists and for the team as seamless as possible. But I do think that there is something interesting that the artists are really excited to use it. The top of the studio is really excited to use it, and sometimes it's this middle part that really resists change, because they maybe have carved out a portion of the role that they like.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a synonymous thing where it's been trending. I think the last 3 4 years when we start hearing the term solo developer, right, quote
Yeah,
unquote, right. People have like a very flexible of a definition for that, but like essentially, it's what used to take a bigger team is
yeah,
able, you're able to do it with a smaller team now, and that you talk about like the developers are largely supported. The top execs love it, of course.
yeah,
And then the consumer level, it's not even, in my opinion, that close in terms of the support on like, yeah, I love these triple A or double A quality games. And I
yeah,
love the fact that it's like a small team. Like there seems to be,
yeah.
especially this year with Power Worlds, recently Maynard Lords, all these like traditionally what would take a bigger team is being pushed by these smaller teams, and it's becoming a selling point about how look at what we can achieve with how little people we got. Like it's better than any marketing that bigger games are doing with like ads and billboards and stuff. Would love
Well,
to
and I
kind of
think
hear your
those are
opinion. Yeah.
yeah, I think those are examples though where they were great game concepts. They're incredibly creative and fun to play. And that's not AI. That's the people who are developing these games. And I think that's maybe what I'm trying to say in a sense is, yes, AI can help you build larger worlds. It can help you ship games much faster. It can help you iterate and work through multiple ideas almost simultaneously. But what's going to, therefore, if those barriers to entry are coming down, and if you're able to, with a smaller team, make a lot larger, interesting AAA quality kind of games, what's going to really stand out is the creative part of this process. And I think that's what everybody's really excited about, because then all of a sudden, that's where being an exceptional game developer means that you're just exceptionally creative and know your market and know the game that you want to create really well. And it's not just that you're a great 3D modeler.
So we're in like a very critical time in the industry, right? Just today, at least in terms of recording, right? Microsoft just talked about a slew of studios from Bethesda, right? Which is like a trend that's been going on for a year and a half, right? But a lot of this too is just there does need, unfortunately, a rethinking about how we approach bigger budget games, right?
Yeah.
That model just doesn't work. It's
Yeah.
kind of backbreaking. A lot of these games kind of make these bets for 5+ years and really wonder why it doesn't work, because it's a big gambling move on a lot of parts. And at the same time, we're starting to see these success from smaller teams, but like kind of mid-range studios really experimenting with this idea of early access, like testing the game
Yeah.
before basically having these measures and gates in place to ensure that this game being built is built towards their key audience, right? And
Yeah.
instead of just trying to hypothesize that this is what our audience wants and then bang or bust,
Yeah.
right? Would love to kind of see, with all this happening, with you guys being like in leading front with AI tools, just enabling uh maybe as a solution to what we're going through, like what are your thoughts about what's happening right now, coincidentally all at the same time?
It's such an interesting time. I think the way that we've seen it is, I agree fully that this older model of years of development for hopefully a really large spike in engagement and then as long a tail as the game can sustain is a very risky and probably kind of outdated model. I think what is interesting, I've heard it referred to as games becoming platforms. So it's games that are constantly engaging attention, releasing new content, giving people a reason to continue to play those games. I think from an AI perspective, and specifically from the tech we've built at Atlas, the way we see it is creativity is becoming part of the gameplay. And I really like that sort of idea because it means things like users being able to generate their own content. That's a way to help someone have attachment to those games, to increase their attention and the reason they would want to get back into those games. Being able to put out more updates to the map, for example, or larger kind of narrative constructs there. I think these are all areas that AI can actually add a lot of value and help that model of you don't need to close yourself off for several years and work towards a one big release, but rather think about a game as an evolving and an ongoing platform. And I think that probably wouldn't have been possible in some ways without technology like ours a few years ago.
The community involvement is definitely, I mean, with UGC, user generated content, specific games, it was kind of like the subgenre. It's starting to blend in. We're seeing like games like Fortnite integrating as part of their like major pillar, right? It's definitely a consideration now more than ever for just, I would say, regular traditional games, right?
Yeah.
um in much the way that DLC was a thing, and then I'm going to say it, microtransactions and loot
Yeah.
boxes like was hated at first, but slowly embraced when people were spending the time to integrate it correctly, right? Um, this idea of AI enabling an artist to communicate with the community without having to sit there and make things poly by poly, right? And having that speed, like what possibilities, what potential does Atlas have, or what thinking on a personal level goals that you think will kind of bridge that even better? Uh, that it doesn't have to be a specific user generated game, but let's say any other game that everyone's looking forward to, like I don't know. I still got to watch it. What's that? The show Fallout, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's just say Fallout for example, which is a
Yeah.
traditional single player game, doesn't have multiplayer support,
Yeah.
has a huge community. There's like this blossoming idea of like, I want to get involved. Can I get my name on that somehow, or like,
Yeah.
can I put my face? So, what potential do you see like with this AI
So
driven technology into something like
So
that?
for us, I mean, this is such a nice use case for us. So you could think about when we build an AI model for a client, the world that that AI model knows are the references, the stylistic references that were given to us from the client. So this is the client's IP in this case. So we get, you know, so the artists spend time to create mood boards and or reference images, or maybe if it's a sequel, it might be past game art. But regardless, this is the aesthetic world that the AI knows. And then the other side of this is technical. So the other side are certain gameplay constraints. This should have certain LODs or mesh topology or other reasons to be optimized within a gameplay performance setting. And so a game developer would use our technology to iterate, build open worlds quicker, look through different ideas and options and refine the AI, basically give feedback to the AI as it is generating, and then that feedback would be internalized and go to building a more robust generator. What's interesting then is if you want to give that AI access to that AI over to a user, you can do so with a certain level of confidence that no matter what the user, let's say if the interface were text prompting, for example, no matter what the user text prompts, the results should aesthetically fit within the context of that world, because that's the formal language that AI learned through its training process. And no matter what that structure, what that weapon, what that environment that was created by the user, it should also be performant, because that's again kind of the guardrails that were placed on this AI as it was being built. So the kind of interesting thing then is that this goes back maybe to that original point. Compared to a procedural system, you're not going to get a lot of copies of copies. You're not going to see that all the users are just building sort of some variant of the same thing. Actually, everybody will be generating really very unique assets in different forms, depending on how they're able to think about describing those assets or having some sort of dialogue or user experience with the AI. But from the game developer's perspective, you know that you're still building within the same world. You're still building within the same IP, and you're still building within a set of performance constraints that works for your game. So you're able to kind of let the user really just go a bit wild with this. And I think that's really kind of a cool proposition. And we have a couple of games that are in development now that are working on that premise as well.
Yeah, I think the interesting point that you're bringing up that not a lot of people make a connection to is that proceduralism has always been celebrated, right? It was this
Yeah.
idea that it has infinite possibilities within constraint, obviously, but very handmade and tailored and
Yes.
time consuming, right? Because these are possibilities, I would say, it's kind of like this what do you say, very controlled amount of
Yeah.
possibilities, right? It has to be thought out, it has to be planned, it has to be produced, right? By very traditional game development methods.
Yeah.
And this idea that proceduralism, if you really look at it, has always been laying the groundwork to what essentially is the ultimate idea, which is AI generated content, because you do want to be able to. I mean, I have this theory that all games are leading to the matrix, right? Good or bad. But like it's this idea of being able to walk in the world and having a very unique experience compared to other players based on your own decisions. I mean, this is what dialogue trees have always been about in RPG. This is the idea of making your own character. People have always kind of leaned in to wanting to personalize their character or player, their avatar, right?
Yeah.
Um, so like it's a very interesting connection that I don't think the community really talks about that much when we talk about AI. Like, is this in your
I
circle,
think
in your
I think
AI
to be
huddles, is
honest,
this a common
yeah.
thing? Yeah.
I think I couldn't agree more with sort of proceduralism laying the foundation for AI. I think to some extent it results from the specific technology that we've built at Atlas, if I'm honest, because we started building our tech pre-ChatGPT, pre-Midjourney, pre-Stable Diffusion. So we were looking at a world where we saw that exact problem with procedural design. If you created a Gothic cathedral procedurally, and somebody tested that game and said this would be really cool if it was more of like a futuristic cathedral, it would be very, very difficult to make those changes. You would, because the procedural code is so inflexible at a certain point. It could do a lot of really cool variants of Gothic cathedrals, but it wouldn't be able to switch over to futurism, because when you write procedural code, you kind of need to know the answer before you start writing it. You need to direct the code down a certain path. And so we started looking and thinking, well, what if AI could basically learn procedural rules and relationships out of these images? And so somebody could generate that Gothic cathedral with AI and then say, you know what, here's a couple of reference images of really futuristic buildings. I would like that to now enter your training data and your data set, and try to learn those new rules that can build that type of geometry and those types of relationships. And so in the world that I operate in, and the world that sort of we've built at Atlas, our AI is very much an extension and sort of a new way of looking at procedural content creation, which is more generative in nature and more goal oriented towards more based around reference images from clients and gameplay constraints. But I do think that from that perspective, that's why I also see AI as this great tool that people can use to make really cool and creative experiences, in the same way that when you have that perfect procedural generator, like Unreal has, a lot of really nice tools now around procedural content generation, the PCG tools, that you can do stuff that is really exciting, really cool, and you can do it really quickly.
One of the things that I think game developers, or as a parent, right, that we're facing is like, yeah, this is all exciting, but like there's so much changing. The outlook of what's ahead is like uncharted territory for the very first time, because it's that disruptive. What advice do you have? Like my son, for example, is like, yeah, not really asking this. I'm kind of thinking this out for him. It's like, what should I be doing? It's like, I don't know, be an astronaut, learn to be a carpenter. I mean, those trade skills aren't going to go anywhere. It's like, I have no idea. Like we're talking about like industries, even as a lawyer, which used to be like this glorified job for basically the anti-artist, right? I was like, that's being replaced too, man. At least the entry level stuff. You don't need people reading your contract anymore. So, like, what advice do you have for those that either in creative fields or others? Like, what should they kind of lean into if they're trying to build towards a career? Like, what would be the most exciting, profitable in terms of just a kid out of college that they should be looking at, or at least, interested in?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think there's a couple things. I mean, one is that AI is in a hype cycle right now. So we are in this kind of euphoria phase of it, where we are all imagining the millions of countless, endless things that it can do. But we should also keep in mind that, like, somebody just graduating college today, there still are, within, for example, game development, like very traditional constraints about how meshes are generated or created, and how levels are designed and things like this. And so, looking 5 and 10 years out into the future, there will be all sorts of, I think, wild new models, in the way that not only we create games, but that we play and experience games. But I think coming from a foundation that you understand how the world works today is really also very important. And I think that's the same then carries on to creativity. So if you're just, if you look at really like what I talk about it maybe from more of like an artist perspective than a game developer, because that's a little bit more closely tied to my background. But, if you look at when I was training to become an architect, the core competence of an architect is understanding spatial and formal relationships. There's a ton of interesting tools and technologies that architects can use, whether it's old school, sketching those buildings out, or using, designing with VR sculpting. But the core competency there is really about thinking through formal and spatial and creative relationships. And I think in game dev or other creative fields, you would have that too. So I think it's twofold. It's one, like really learn those kind of core fundamental properties that would help you be creative, that would help you make really successful intellectual property or projects like that. And then the second part of that is just embrace every tool you can. Just learn tooling like crazy. I think that you don't want to get left behind. You want to be able to, if everybody else is able to generate their games super quickly, you should also be able to generate your games super quickly, so that it still sort of stands on the shoulders of your creativity as to what will make your project successful.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main thing that doesn't get emphasized enough. I like using myself as an example, right? I went to art school, game art school, right? So I can create games, my own games, right? And it was I went the traditional route of going AAA, basically helping others make their games to get to the point to gather enough experience to get to a point where I can start making my own games, right? And a lot of people don't really kind of equate the things that are available now, are the tools being super resourceful, enabling basically with anyone with an idea to go straight to Steam, right? The pathway has never been easier, and it does require like a rethinking of how a traditional career and what that means. And not a lot of people are I think people who are receptive to the AI tools nowadays are more aware of that fact, that it's like, oh, finally, I don't have the barriers of needing to go down this route, earn my stripes or whatever, right? I have an idea that I can present to the masses, essentially, right? And that creativity, that combats the idea of overemphasis on techniques, right? Tools and techniques has kind of like been like the main argument, in my opinion, of why this should not exist or whatever. Like, I would love to kind of hear your thoughts about that.
I love this kind of older like hacker culture where you just try to break stuff as well. I remember when I was back to kind of that idea that as an architect you're focused on formal and spatial qualities. I was playing around with you could find some brain scanning software online, and then you could feed it renderings that you did, and it was coming out with weird new formations. And they weren't great architecture, to be honest, but they were still something that you could play around with and just try to understand, like, how can you push tech to be used in new situations? How can you try to go beyond what everybody else is doing? And I think especially when it comes to AI right now, that's really interesting, because these tools are sophisticated. There's no doubt about that, but they're also relatively new. At least our technology that we've built has only been around for 3 years. So there are plenty of games that take our tech, and all of a sudden they've trained it on classical European houses, and then they're making giant skyscrapers out of it. And for me, that's incredibly interesting, because that was not the intended way this technology would be used. I thought it would be used, if they trained it on a particular asset class, it would be very good for generating within that style. But in the misuse, they were able to get things that were highly creative, highly interesting, things that, at least we as a team internally hadn't seen other game developers using. And so that kind of stuff, I think, is really cool. And I think the industry is so ripe for that now. When everything is moving this quickly, when new tools and plugins and AI and procedural techniques are being released, week after week, I think it's an ideal opportunity to find your niche, creatively or aesthetically as well.
Yeah, I think at the heart of game development in general, it is the iterative process. That's essentially what the problem and the what is celebrated at the end is. Like, so there are games and budgets constraints, and the artists or developers are overly spending on iterative, and because there's not enough time, and essentially not having enough time to kind of work off of uh, these iteration loops that suffice to an end result,
Yeah.
right? So I think AI really speeds that up, and why people secretly or not still secretly are using these tools, because they're able to kind of like pick and choose and see results faster, and able to kind of make decisions faster, and not have to uh, essentially kind of compromise their vision, right?
I think it's such a valid point. It's something that actually we have to, like, developers of the AI tools, and specifically at Atlas, we've had to put a lot of emphasis on it, because we don't want the value proposition of somebody who's using our tech to be, you take it or leave it. You described that I'm looking for a medieval landscape where cottages, create an ominous feeling or something like that. The value proposition should not be either yes or no and then just reprompting. It should be that everything comes back in a way that you can iterate over it. Okay, I like this. I like this part of the map. I'm going to select this over here. Or the hero asset that it's created is cleanly modeled with discrete parts and segmentation information. So if I want to go and start to add cracks in the window, or instance certain pieces of geometry, or change the material, like, you want to facilitate that iterative process, and to your point, you want to facilitate that you can do it quicker. But I think that for us, that's really important, because if your value proposition to an artist or a game developer is describe what you want and then either take or leave the asset as is, I think that's not a particularly fun or creative value proposition. But if you're able to say, play with this, change it, work with the AI to make it better. Let the AI learn your preferences a little bit, so that the next time you're generating another asset in this world, it's more apt to what you're looking for. I think that's a much more interesting and compelling value proposition for people to play around with, and that's basically what we're building.
Cool. And would you mind elaborating, like, these use or misuse cases that when you're working with the clients, like they kind of inspire like ideas that you guys didn't think about? Because a lot of it's kind of like the early access. It's like you put it out there, you have an original vision, and people play with it, and then they start kind of sparking these ways that they're using or misusing. That are like, oh, you know what? This kind of, we should go back to the drawing board and integrate something like this. Have you? I'm sure experience some of that, and just to kind of give some detail if you can.
Yeah, I mean, I can give sort of some general examples that we've had that have been pretty interesting. I think one of the examples that I really liked was we were generating we were generating a city where you could enter the building. So we were generating the interiors as well. And one of the things that they wanted was to encourage close combat shooting, like close combat inside the buildings. And so we thought, like, at first we were kind of just using like a very simple, if it met the criteria that they were looking for, it was shown to the client, and if not, then it was thrown out as a generation. And then one of the things they suggested to us was, hey, what if can we have this more holistically being generated with our aesthetics? So we actually built in a loss function that said, okay, consider the lines of sight when you're generating an interior to a structure. And the difference was then that meant it had to balance the aesthetics of the interiors with a very technical constraint, in this case, lines of sight. But it led to results that were far more intrinsically interesting, because you got close combat environments, but they were not something structured or straightforward. They were kind of weird angles and parts of the building where this happened. And then that was particularly interesting, because then the game developer was able to sort of say, okay, let's save this configuration here in the building, and let's regenerate the other parts of it. And I thought that was really interesting, because I wouldn't typically have thought before that about an idea as abstract as close combat shooting as being part of something that the AI, when it's generating formal language, should consider. But I think that speaks to the fact that these are fairly complex systems, and you're able to integrate, even kind of abstract ideas, if you can somehow put it into a quantifiable way that an AI system can understand.
Yeah, I definitely can correlate to that. Like this idea that I think initially when people are introduced, and people forget, like ChatGPT, for example, was only like a year old, right? When it kind of came on the scene pretty strong. And I think initially everyone kind of used it as kind of like a prompter, is like, all right, give me what you got, right? But
Yeah.
like recently, in terms of the technology evolving, people who are using it are evolving in terms of their technique. Like it's not just about like, trying to get answers from a ready trained system. It's about training the system now to kind of make it
Yeah.
better for your specific use cases, your specific needs, and more treating it now like an assistant, like being or even a writing buddy, and I think I'm like people are kind of collectively doing that at the same time. Like for example, my son, right? He's 13. It's like I have no idea what his future's like, right? So that's why I'm asking all these questions. But at the same time, he has like a creative writing class. Like, yeah, usually I would sit there with him and like I was watching him doing this, and he was like kind of really, really like struggling, thinking about it, and he was just, I don't know where to start, I don't know where to go, because it's one of his first writing assignment. Like in kids these days, like I don't even know.
Tough. Yeah.
I'm impressed they can even write, right? But like I'm sitting there and I'm introducing to this, like this is a writing buddy, and this is the things you want to kind of start with, describe what you want, and it presents you these different cases. Now you got to train it. It's like, hey, I like this, I don't like this. What about this? And we're adding, subtracting, and changing his initial prompts. But at the same time, like sitting there, this is serving as kind of like a starting off point. The most important thing is you got to maintain your competitive edge, right? If it takes you 5 seconds, it'll take someone else 5 seconds to do this, right? What is your input? What makes you different, right? And that is something I feel like a lot of developers that are really kind of standing apart are doing. Like they're not just doing the basic thing. They're really working with the AI model to kind of make sure that their competitive edge is still there, right?
Yeah, because your competitive edge is not going to be that you used AI or you didn't. The competitive edge is going to be how were you able to use AI, and were the ideas that you put into the system or the way you used the technology furthering something that is unique and creative and specific to to your competitive edge. And I think that's really nice. I mean, you see it a lot with the GPT models, right? You can have it generate text for you, but that's probably not particularly interesting because it's somewhat generic text. But if you're able to train it in your voice, if you're able to then use that as a way to think about different ways to write or to describe something, and then ultimately make that your own, that's very unique and very competitive. Yeah.
So we touched about this a bit, where with new technology, previous technology, tools that have enabled developers to create things faster before, there were worries about teams being scaled down, right? But we saw the exact opposite, to this, what's going on right now. Teams are bigger than ever, right? And the main thing is that ideas are not being tested faster, I think essentially is the problem with. It's not about the teams being bigger. It's just that because of management, that's tough. I think that's definitely not talked about enough. Just managing large teams is hard, but also the idea of just testing ideas, being iterative. Would you mind kind of digging into like your thoughts with where do you see these teams? Are they going to stay at the size, going bigger, smaller at first? Like what's your anticipation on what's going to be happening now?
My anticipation is that these teams that are huge will reduce in size. So if it's a 500-person team, I think that's very difficult already in its current state to effectively manage or run efficiently, even for these really big studios. So I think there will be instances there where those teams scale down in size, and tools like AI help to continue to be as efficient as they were before. But that's a fairly small subset of the industry. I think what we will see is we will see a lot more of the like small and medium-sized game developers coming online, because they will be able to leverage the tools to more rapidly create, publish, iterate, test games And I think then what we'll have is ideally like a little bit of like a Cambrian explosion of new games, new ideas that are really trying to ideally push the boundary of maybe what's experimental in terms of aesthetics, in terms of narratives, in terms of gameplay. And we can see how the industry as a whole starts to shift and starts to move. So is it, people are really excited by the user generated content, the UGC games. People are really excited by games that embrace, worlds beyond scales we've ever played before, but are filled with content, right? Not just empty kind of worlds. Are we really focused on maybe the proliferation of kind of AAA quality standards means that we're super focused on some of the other narrative, components of the gameplay, which I think would be quite interesting. So that's my guess, is that you'll have a bit of a growth in the small and medium sized teams, because we'll find that from a relatively small group of people you can make very interesting games, but that the really really large scale teams will come down in size a bit.
I would love to kind of hear your thoughts about, I would say it's a phenomenon, right? These day one releases and suddenly it's dominating the headlines. I would say, yes, Baldur's Gate 3 is number 3 of the series, but no one knew that was coming out, at least in my opinion, right? It just came out and everybody's playing it the same way Mailing Lords is playing, Pal Worlds, like there's interesting articles talking about how marketing and advertising, and I know this is outside of AI, but at the same time it might be tied to it, right? The idea of journal articles coming out, there's like this premeditated marketing campaign that happens before a game release, trailers, these game award events that like tells people this is coming out, look out for it, is not as dominant as it used to be. Like the games that are being sold like crazy and making headlines are when it's released day one. So what is your thoughts about this thing that's been happening in the last year and a half, I would say, which I don't understand, and it's completely not traditional to how I hear about games before it's released. Yeah.
I'll be honest. I think I also don't understand it as much. I mean, it's amazing to see, because the virality of some of these games or even experiences sometimes that are also coming out, it's so exciting, because I've also gotten caught up in the moment before, and then all of a sudden everybody you see is everybody is posting about it or talking about it. So that builds the momentum and the hype in and of itself. I think maybe the only semi-intelligent thing I could say here is that I think it's this idea that attention these days is our scarcest resource, because everybody is pulling for attention. And so a lot of the games that I see that kind of have this day one spike or are games that capture that attention really, really well. And it remains to be seen to some extent for how long they capture it, and that's where I think things like creativity becoming part of gameplay can help extend the life of that virality and help games to move to that next milestone. But I think, to me, one of the things that I'm always thinking about when we talk with game developers, because we get pitched a lot of really interesting games. That's probably one of the really nice things actually about our company is, we talk to people that are building a ton of interesting games. They have cool ideas. They have and I'm always sort of focused on this idea that attention is so scarce these days, and if you can build something that, especially that's a bit unique, then it kind of can grab the attention and hopefully go a bit viral as well.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting time to there's so many games coming out like all the time. And it's nice to hear that the games that stick are just games that people generally enjoy. Like,
it's nice that they don't have to come from a huge budget either.
Yes, and in terms of sustainability, because the way these games are made with smaller team sign is like, oh, we only sold 1 million copies, but there's 3 of you. Yeah, we're fine. Yeah, you are fine. So it's a different mentality, right? I think a few years ago it was kind of scary, at least for me, and I think for a lot of devs, a lot of games. I think from Square Enix, it was kind of like disheartening to hear. It's like, wow, we only sold 8 million copies. We might have to. It's been a bad year. It was like, well, what else do you want? It's like, how bad is your planning? For where 8 million copies is like a disappointment, right? It was a bad trend that I feel like. Because of the indie development or the smaller team is saving from us kind of going down that route. And I felt like it happened a few times. I think, before Tomb Raider, there was, I think at the end of PlayStation 3 era, there was so many studio shutdowns. But like, it's a little different from now, even though there are studio shutdowns. It's more like there seems to be a change of how we approach making games, more so than just like games are not being popular, which is the exact opposite. It's more popular than ever. So there's a really interesting time in terms of like what's happening and people's different interpretations. But I think everyone can agree is like people still love playing games. People still love. We have more people making games more than ever. There's just a generations.
And you pair it with technology, and now all of a sudden, sort of the barriers to entry to make games are coming down.
Yeah.
So you have even sort of the possibility to make that trend sort of exponentially more interesting.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot happening, culminating to a lot. I think more success. Like this year alone, like I would say at the end of last year and then this year, every month it's like, oh, there's this guy or this group of small you never heard of, and they're selling bonkers. It's the most consistent amount of successful game stories that I've ever witnessed. Usually things like this, you only hear one big game a year, and now it's like every month. Everyone's having their time to shine. It's a shared stage, but everyone is walking away a success. So it's definitely underemphasized on how fortunate this time is for the industry, despite like the things that are happening. It's like, hey, this is the class A, changing of times. It's like something's happening here.
And like you say, people are still really excited by these games. Like gaming's not going anywhere. It's people are more than ever like looking for that cool, unique, interesting game to play. So I think it's a great time.
Yeah, and I think the price point of these games is the key thing. That $40, that $30 is what people love. That actually means that we hit an hour mark. Hopefully it's been as painless as it was for you, as for me. This is actually the part of the podcast where I shut up and hand the mic over to you to talk directly to the listeners and viewers out there about whatever you want to talk about.
Well, thanks. No, it's been really a pleasure. I think what's been nice about this is we do a lot of work with AAA studios. We do a lot of work with big game developers, but I think a lot of times the games and the projects that we work on that I'm most excited by are a lot of the smaller, medium, indie-sized game developers. We are at Atlas, we are for the first time kind of starting to open up our tech to more plug and play approaches to try and take that technology that we've built and give that to small and medium-sized game developers. So we're doing a little bit of alpha testing at the moment. If there's any listeners that are building a game that's interesting and cool and wants to participate in our alpha testing program, get your hands on some cool new exciting 3D generative AI technology, please reach out. Our website is atlas.design and you can find all of our contact information there. But I think that for me would be really the only call to action here. I think we're really excited to always talk to game developers, talk to artists who are building interesting things. And if we can support that, we would be really happy to.
Fantastic, man. It's a pleasure having you on. I always love talking about AI, especially now. So learned a lot. So thank you. To everyone else, See you guys all next week.